Welcome and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jordan Money. I am the Director of Events and Communications here at the Center for Security Studies and the Security Studies program. A few quick notes too before I turn it over to our speaker for the day. First, you all have been automatically muted upon joining the Zoom session. Please do remain on mute unless you are asking a question so that we don't have any background noise. You all are used to the Zoom etiquette by this point, I am sure. You may have your camera either on or off. It is totally up to you. For the Q&A portion in particular, we do encourage you to turn your camera on so that our speaker can engage a little bit more with the audience. On that note, we will have plenty of time for Q&A. Please do hold your questions until the end of Dr. Joja's initial presentation, but you are welcome to and encouraged to ask questions. So you can either put them in the chat and I will ask them out loud for you, or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom and I will call on you to ask your question. And then finally, this session is being recorded, so keep in mind that anything you say will be recorded as will your video if you choose to turn it on while you are speaking. While you're not speaking, your video will not be recorded. With all of that out of the way, I would like to introduce Dr. Iulia Joja. Dr. Joja is an adjunct professor here at the Center for Security Studies and a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Her research and teachings primarily focus on European and Black Sea security, which is why we have her here today. Prior to her current roles, Dr. Joja served as an advisor to the Romanian president and as a deputy project manager at NATO Allied Command Transformation in Virginia. She has worked with the Romanian delegation to the UN, the European Parliament, and the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She was also a visiting scholar at the Center of Military History and Social Sciences of the German Armed Forces in Potsdam and Berlin, and a DAAD postdoctoral fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins SAIS. With all of that said, I will turn it over to Dr. Joja.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you, big thank you to CSS for hosting me today as a part of this fantastic series of lectures. I will be talking today to you about emergent spaces of insecurity along geopolitical fault lines. The story of these emergent spaces of insecurity can be told through different lenses, of course, in IR, by either looking through neorealist lenses of revisionist powers, most notably Russia and Turkey, and increasingly so China. But the other lens is of looking at these emergent spaces of insecurity by focusing on contested spaces themselves, these contested spaces between them. In other words, the geopolitical landscape between Russia and Turkey. And this is the lens that I would like to offer to you today, because most importantly, these contested spaces between Russia, Turkey, increasingly China, also overlap with Western spaces. And also because this happens to be currently my day job as a senior fellow at the Frontier Europe initiative at the Middle East Institute here in DC. My job is to help develop Western strategy for arguably the most contested of these spaces that we are going to talk about today, the Black Sea region. The presentation I have prepared for you today is part of a book project, or an incipient part of a book project that I'm currently working on with regards to new power competition and region making. So I'm particularly glad that I have such an amazing opportunity today to speak at the Georgetown CSS lecture series, and I welcome as many questions and as much feedback from you as possible today. The way I want to approach this today is in two parts, really. In the first part, I'd like to show you, with the help of Google Earth, some competing powers and how competing powers are increasing their interaction, both hostile and amicable, in these contested spaces. And then in the second part, I want to briefly run by you the most relevant policy and strategy issues where we need to change a bit our thinking to be able to keep up with our policy aims here in the United States and the West overall. I have structured my geopolitical story today of contested spaces in 4 layers on Google Earth that form these spaces and that are sort of the pillars along which calculations of competing powers are currently made. And here, a special and big thank you goes out to Cristian Tataru in Bucharest, who helped me build these layers on Google Earth. Without him, I would have taken a century to build them, and he's done fantastic help here for this presentation, so big thank you. Let me share my screen now, so I can show you the layers that I am talking about. And I'll be looking at the same time also at some of my notes as I talk you through them. The 4 layers are geography, energy, military capabilities and conflicts, and political competition. And as I talk you through these layers, I will be moving in the order from, let's say, the most solid layer, the movable geography, to the increasingly fluid layers of energy, defense, and the most fluid, the political competition among some of the fault lines. So the first layer that we're talking about today is geography. You must have noticed by now that I have not really named the region that we're talking about. Just give me 1 second here to pull up some of the notes. There we go. The first layer is geography, and I have not named the region because we have no name for it so far. It is really the geographic space in which Europe and Asia and the Middle East meet. And we know that this region is being divided right now in our understanding between the Black Sea right here, the South Caucasus right here, and the Middle East. But these are geopolitical concepts, right? Not regions in a truly geographic sense. And then we have the Black Sea region, the Middle East, and the South Caucasus, the Levant. These are all geopolitical areas that shape right now our understanding of this region. These names are how we predominantly conceptualize some of these regions, or the region overall right now. 30 years ago, we thought about this region as a confrontation line between NATO and Warsaw Pact members and non-aligned countries. Now it's the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, etc. And this is a big problem that we have here present in DC at state or DOD, as well as in the capitals of US allies in the region, but I'll get to that in the second part. Now, if you ask me where, here is the geography layer, the first one. If you ask me where the choke point is of this region, it would be right here in Istanbul. And on this map, this little layer, you can see the maritime traffic between the Eastern Med and the Black Sea. This choke point is really the key between, or the central part of this region. But you can also see by looking at this map that what we are facing, if we're looking at these 3 seas, is a lot of land and very little maritime space. And this is sort of the thesis of today's presentation, that we are juggling in this region, in this space, between too much land and not enough sea to be shared. I'm going to first highlight the seaways that I'm talking about. Here you can see them as I'll remove the choke point for a second. In blue, Eastern Med, if you limit it by Libya, the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They're separated by the Istanbul choke point and are landlocked if you're looking between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Now, here are the littoral states around these three seas. Here is the Eastern Med with about 9 member states that have littoral access to the Eastern Med. And here is the economic exclusive zones as divided by these lines between these countries, with some extra claims and disputes right here in the southern part of Turkey. But we'll get to that a bit later. Then we have the Black Sea with the littoral states around it. That's 6 countries with an overlap of Turkey, right, which is both Eastern Med and the Black Sea, and the economic zones between them. And then we have the Caspian Sea with an overlap in Russia, in overall 5 littoral states in green then. So yellow, Black Sea, green, Caspian, and brown is the Med. And they overlap to some extent. So we have a total of 19 countries. And out of those, we have direct access to more than one sea by 2 countries, Russia and Turkey, that overlap, which is interesting. And I have also highlighted here the economic exclusive zones, EEZs, of these countries, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Caspian, with the delimitations. These EEZs were established at the United Nations only in '82 as areas of up to 200 nautical miles off the coast, in which nations can exercise sovereign, exclusive exploitation rights of the resources in their maritime exclusive zones. If the maritime space from a country's coast to the next, as we have virtually everywhere in the 3 seas that we're talking about, overlap, and there is a smaller distance than these 400 nautical miles, the countries have to negotiate the dividing line in the middle. Now, in this part of the world, the sea is so small and the landmass is so large that EEZs of these countries overlap, are contested, and increasingly the topic or a key area of new power competition. And I'll show you this in a minute when we look at the energy layer as well. But finally, on the geography layer, we have one more mini layer, and that is if the maritime spaces weren't contested enough among littoral countries, there's also the external powers with primary stakes in free navigation. Here you go, you have the UK and France with expensive interests in free navigation in this space, and not only. And if we are to zoom out, you also see China, and all the way on the other end, the United States. All these countries, major powers, have free navigation interests in this region that they're trying to explore and exploit as well. And this is kind of the geography layer, the immovable geography. Now, if we are talking about energy, we have basically 2 issues: energy resources and energy transit in this region. Let me zoom a little bit closer in so we can see it. If you are looking here at the energy resources before, so about 30 years ago, around 1989, the end of the Cold War, we have highlighted the nuclear power plants that existed at that point, and also the producers of energy around 1990. So we have Russia, that is, excuse me, a main producer and supplier, especially to Europe as one of the largest consumers. We have Iran, we have at that point Syria, Egypt and Libya still ongoing, and Romania with an asterisk because Romania is producing an almost independent, but is at least in '89 not exporting yet. And these are the producers in 1990. And then you also have The transit, just very briefly, in 1989, to give you an overlook, which confirms kind of the producers. You have in red and blue oil and gas from Russia flowing extensively into Europe as the main supplier. And then you have, to a limited extent, going from the south to the north from Iran to a certain extent, and then pipelines and mainly energy through ports in the south of the Eastern Med. And this is the pipelines in 1989, but just to go now make a jump to the present today, we have this is what it looks like in 2020. Nuclear power plants, oil and gas fields, and LNG. So we have here, if you look at the difference, a couple of new or a few nuclear power plants popping up. The white and yellow is Russian technology, and you have increasingly combined Western, or in that space partially, you cannot see it because it's still projects, Western nuclear energy in Romania, and increasingly so as tentatives to explore that in the region. Then you have oil and gas fields compared to 1989. That is the big difference. Let me zoom in. And you can see here on the Black Sea, blue is energy that is being offshore in the Black Sea. Red is contested energy offshore, formerly Ukraine, now part of Crimea after annexation. In the Caspian Sea, you have blue gas and yellow oil, so a lot popping up there. And then in the Eastern Med, you also have a lot popping up all the way to the west in Libya, but also massively increases here in the what we conventionally know as the Eastern Med, with again blue gas, yellow oil, and red contested with some of the issues around Cyprus offshore exploration, and not only. So you can see how this is a big difference in terms of how it looked like 30 years ago and how it looks like now. And then LNG is something completely new. If you look at it, just this layer, you have now LNG ports or platforms or hubs popping up around the coast of the Eastern Med, in the Aegean right here, and increasingly closer to the Black Sea, but not yet, with one exception, in the Caspian Sea, not really yet in this space. But if you go back if we are to go back 1 second to 1989 and compare that, or 1990, and compare that to what we have today, this shows you how increasingly contested, with the help of new energy resources, this space is becoming. And you can also see, if you look at the power plants here, the nuclear power plants, there's one thing that should be noted, that some of the projects you cannot see yet on the map, but you also have Western technology I mentioned, but increasingly Chinese technology and power plants competing in the Black Sea region with Western and Russian technology, as Turkey is working with China, and China bid unsuccessfully due to recent US vetoes in developments of nuclear power plants all the way here in Bulgaria and Romania. The offshore rigs I showed you, that's developing and pretty contested. LNG as well is making a big difference to the region, as you see the hubs popping up. Mostly these are directly supported by the United States, which in the meantime has replaced Russia and Saudi Arabia as #1 energy producer worldwide. And you can see attempts from the United States to bring LNG for energy diversification to this region as well. Now, let me show you also the producers, 1989 compared to 2020. That changed quite a bit too. So Syria is not a producer anymore. But you can see around the Caspian Sea, that all countries now independent after the fall of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You have Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan as energy producers and exporters now, and you have in the Eastern Med, of course, Israel, and increasingly so moves around Cyprus. And further offshore exploitation around Egypt, of course, and that space, that conventional space of the Eastern Med. Now, what is also interesting on this map of energy is that who are not the countries that are not highlighted as energy producers. And we have countries that are absent all around here, like Ukraine, with disputed areas around Crimea in a dispute or actually conflict with Russia. And you have increasingly Turkey, as we will see in the next few years and briefly in this presentation, popping up as an attempt or in the future potential energy producer as well, not just transit. But the most telling example of how disputed offshore energy has become in this space is Ukraine. If you look here at the map, before the 2014 annexation, Ukraine has had the largest coastline on the Black Sea, and hence the largest exclusive economic zone. If I am to highlight here, and geography, again, the economic exclusive zones in the Eastern Med. There you go. These are all contested areas. We don't know what's down there really, because if we are to zoom in on the Black Sea, we will be seeing on Google Earth a light color difference between deep sea, offshore drilling in deep sea, and shallow sea. Everything that is around Ukraine here is mostly shallow in the lighter color. And we know that the deeper you drill, the more chances you have to get to find significant resources. So we don't know for Ukraine specifically in this place in the north of the Black Sea, what's down there, because in 2014 Ukraine had only started exploring after Romania right here hit the first deep sea spring in 2012. Ukraine at the point of annexation of Crimea had contracts with Western companies that had the technology for deep sea drilling, which is pretty new and advanced, at least to this region. But Russia annexing Crimea has taken any chance from Ukraine to become a producer and increase energy independence from Russia. Overall, this is all new technology and still developing. But yes, in a couple of years, you will be able to see maybe Israeli or Egyptian gas getting through LNG terminals and pipelines into Europe through Turkey, for instance. And the US, so you see a lot of diversification, the US as an increasingly regional player as well in this. But for now, energy transit is still heavily dominated by Russia. If you focus on the biggest consumer in the region, the European Unions. Let me show you here for a second. We are in energy. Let me remove this and the geography layer, and let me tell you about the second part of the energy layer, and that is transit. These are the pipelines. Let me zoom out for a second. These are the pipelines as I showed you them a minute before in 1989, and just to make it easier, will remove the other aspects and the producers. So you have the transit pipelines just here. You see the domination of then the Soviet Union, now Russia. In 2020, this is what it looks like, very different. Red, the red lines are oil, where price is not important. So that's both Russia and here in the south. Blue is specifically Russian gas. Purple, all the way here, is Ukrainian gas. Light pink is Azeri gas right here, Trans-Anatolian pipeline, Trans-Adriatic pipeline, and all the way here down to Iran. Yellow is in development, projects that already are being approved and constructed. And black are projects that are still projects. So we have here the Trans-Caspian, and here a big pipeline through the Eastern Med. And then finally, green, if you see it here, a few lines around Romania, is free market, EU owned, up for grabs. So for instance, the Brua or the Trans-Balkan pipeline. And finally, white, you see it here in the south, is Eastern Med gas and interconnector projects, where Israeli gas, again, potentially can lead all the way through Turkey, through the Azeri-Tanap pipeline into Europe. The biggest players, however, remain Russia as an exporter and Europe as a consumer in this space. And so while EU law encourages energy diversification, in practice, almost all pipelines connecting conventional fields in Russia, so not offshore yet, with the big market in the West and Europe, are owned by Russia. The only exception that is really notable in this dependency relationship between Asia and Europe is the TANAP, the Trans-Anatolian pipeline, that taps here into Azeri gas from the economic exclusive zone of Azerbaijan in the Caspian Sea. And this pipeline is so important, not necessarily because of its transport capacity, because it's pretty limited, but because it highlights really the same problem of too much land and not enough sea as the previous geography layer. This region, particularly here, the South Caucasus we're talking about, from Azerbaijan through Georgia, is the only way to get energy that avoids both Russian territory and Iranian territory. That's why it's so important. And the Caspian Sea is crazy rich in resources, as we've seen with the producers popping up here, but they are divided, these resources, mostly between Iran, Russia, and smaller players, Azerbaijan increasingly, and with potential Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. If you tap into them, however, and transport gas, say, to the Black Sea shore, from there on through the pipelines or an LNG terminal, that becomes increasingly diversified, for instance, and that's a possibility in the future. And now if you are to compare the energy transit landscape today to a few decades earlier, you can also see the emergence of Turkey as both a major transit route with several pipelines from Russia, Iran, and Azerbaijan, as well as an emergent energy producer with the big Black Sea offshore discovery here. Last year after initial exploration. Significantly more probably lies in terms of energy for Turkey in the Black Sea, and President Erdogan has already announced further exploitation and discoveries. At the same time, Turkey has been for years in heavy confrontation over here with Greece and Cyprus, and now Egypt, Israel, and France increasingly involved over the EEZ and offshore gas in the Eastern Med right here. So to wrap up this layer, here are the most important transit countries highlighted right here. So you can see that Turkey has emerged as a major transit. So has small Georgia. And we see the conflict over Ukraine a bit more north as a key transit country where Russia is building pipelines to circumvent Ukraine and diminish its geopolitical transit value as a country through, for instance, all the way here, Nord Stream pipelines, but also the South and South Stream, in the South Stream and Blue Stream over here, the two blue lines. All right, that's the energy layer. Now let me remove that so we can talk about the third layer, and that is the military. We have increased energy leading to increased military disputes, which leads to increased militarization, right? So let's have a look at that. This layer is even more fluid than the energy layer, and similarly to the energy layer, we have kind of two under dimensions, the conflicts and the capabilities. As a visual reminder, here in 1992, you have all frozen conflicts at that stage. Cyprus, Nagorno-Karabakh, the two conflicts in Georgia, and Transnistria here in Moldova. And then we have the conflicts 30 years later, 2022, that looks a lot wilder, right? Nagorno-Karabakh in the meantime has been active. Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia have been active in 2008, if you remember. Crimea has been active in 2014. The Donbass right here is still active, and I've highlighted here the disputed or contested region of Novorossiya and in the claim out there. So you have a lot more conflicts already here in this space. And then, of course, you have the ongoing civil war for a decade now in Syria and Libya, with another major continuous conflict. If you look for 1 second at the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, that conflict was reignited just a few months ago, with this time with heavy Turkish involvement. And the resolution of this most recent conflict is the permanent deployment of Russian and Turkish, to a lesser extent, troops in the conflict area, so out of their territory. And then in the Black Sea, another conflict that should be mentioned was right here in 2018, the Azov Sea, where Russia actually created another major choke point, limiting commercial traffic, mostly from in and out of Ukraine, but that included a lot of Western vessels as well. Cyprus is a continuous dispute. We see it right here. Syria and Libya I've mentioned. And then we have the second dimension of the military, the military layer, and that is military bases. So let me unhighlight the conflicts and show you, first of all, the Russian, US, and UK bases out of territory around 1990. So before the fall of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and the fall of the Iron Wall. And here you have some of the Russian bases still on territory back then, Soviet bases. You have the Incirlik Air Base of the United States after Turkey joined NATO, where nuclear weapons are deployed. You have UK older bases here in Cyprus out of territory, and you have then Soviet, now Russian bases in Syria. Now, again, just like the conflicts, the bases here are far more complicated. These are the US bases. You have several popping up around Romania, pretty big bases, and some in Bulgaria as well. And you also have the blue lines, which are the ranges. If I click on them, I can show you this is the range of the ballistic missile defense that the United States and NATO have in Romania and in some others. And here are the UK bases, as highlighted before 89 as well. and then the Russian bases with their ranges. And that makes the whole military layer very complicated, right? Because you have Russia retaining or achieve military presence in former Soviet Union states. You have now the United States with 3 additional bases in Romania, and Ukraine currently competing to ensure as well US troops on its ground. In this instance, you can also see the military buildup in the region that occurred after 2014, with Russia building anti-access area denial here in Crimea on the Black Sea, with a range that makes it a direct threat to Western security and NATO. And then the Russian circles all the way out here are the ranges. The largest ones, if I click on them, are, for instance, the Su-35 range, and here the MiG-31 range out of the A2AD in Crimea. And then you also have the issue of choke points. Here, the Black Sea is home of Russia's most important and most powerful fleet that is constantly or has been constantly updated for the last decade or so. The Black Sea is also the easiest access that Russia has to warm waters, all the way here into the Eastern Med, and hence power projection into the Eastern Med and beyond Syria, Libya, Sudan, as we've seen over the last few years. But military transit or traffic between the Black Sea and the blue circles are US ranges, and you can see here the latest edition, the MQ Reapers, the drones that have been just a month ago or so decided to be deployed in Romania, increasing the US range here as well. And then that brings us to the final layer, and the shortest one, but also the most fluid one, and that is the political layer. This is how the world looked like 30 years ago. Red is the Soviet Union, darker red is the Warsaw Pact, and purple or blue-purple is NATO. In 2020, this looks like that. It is very oversimplified, but the map reveals the complicated value conflict characteristic of today, with the Biden administration rallying democracies together in a summit of values, of democratic values. And Turkey, despite being a NATO member, will probably not be invited, neither will Russia. So you see on this map the countries that oversimplified, right? And you can contest that in questions and feedback, are democracies in the conventional sense. And you have popping up here, of course, Israel, Georgia and Armenia, Greece, and then in red, you have the countries with authoritarian tendencies. That's basically everybody, the rest of what the region looks like. And this already brings me to the conclusions of today, which are very short, and that is a couple of ideas that I want to run by you in terms of how we can think about these regions ahead, as we've looked into the past and into the present today. Here are some of the ideas that we can think about in terms of the conclusions. In a recent panel discussion here in the virtual world in DC, a very smart American, Henry Sokolsky, said, talking about the future of warfare recently, that Europeans tend to focus only on the problem, disregarding the solutions, and then Americans, he was saying, do the opposite. They focus on the solutions and don't care much about the problem. But because I'm a European teaching in America, I want to offer, or try to offer, you both today. So I showed you in detail the problem. Here are a couple of ways to think about solutions. And in my opinion, or I'm convinced that it comes down to regional strategy. The problem that the US and its allies share when it comes to thinking about new power competition in this region is that we don't think about this region as a region. We think about the region as divided into Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. But geographically, These spaces are not clearly divided. On the contrary, here in America, we have the privilege of a clear geography with very few borders. But as you've seen, this is not the case for other continents. And let me give you one example. Romania's capital, Bucharest, where I'm from, is 45 minutes flight away from Istanbul, less than 2 hours away from the Syrian border, a bit more than 2 hours from Tel Aviv in Israel. Yet Bucharest thinks it's in the heart of Europe. Georgia has been trying for decades now to convince the West that it is geographically and politically in Europe. Are Russia and Turkey part of Europe? Are they part of Asia? Are they part of the Middle East? With technology evolving, this region actually reveals itself as an overlapping layers, and that's how we really need to think about it. That's kind of my argument. Here in DC, in the Department of State, 6 Black Sea littoral countries that I've showed you before are divided among 5 different deputy assistant secretaries. So we need a more holistic way, a more holistic way of thinking about the region specifically and regions generally. And 2, we need to develop a holistic strategy for this region, whatever we want to call it. Right now, the United States acts in this region based on bilateral relationships with strategic allies, frenemies, and other actors. Same for other actors, other countries in the region. Strategy based on bilateral thinking leads to limited outcomes because we rarely consider the shared issues as a primary issue, but rather the countries separately with their issues shared or not. But in this region, we're talking about countries that are too many and the maritime spaces that separate them not large enough, leading to conflict and competition, as I've showed you, over geopolitics. If we think in terms of shared spaces of competition instead, we'll be able to put in place regional strategies that are more efficient at leading the competition itself. So this is my first conclusion and recommendation, and I really have 2. The second one is to build regional strategy by prioritizing multilateral alliances. Again, both the United States and its strategic allies in this region think bilaterally. The key is to think multilaterally, which leads to increased cooperation among allies, as we know. We looked at this map today and I pointed to many things present in the region, but absences here are striking too. If you hadn't noticed, except for the US very prominently and the UK a bit and increasingly, there's a rather absence of Western allies, particularly European powers. Now, I teach European security here at Georgetown, so my students and former students know that European powers have not prioritized its East as a security dimension because of differing or contrarian views on Russia. We have seen this voice most recently, for instance, at this year's Munich Security Conference by French President Macron. But it is striking nevertheless and reveals a failure of some of the US strategic allies in the region as well to rally the necessary support for multinational cooperation. As we're speaking today, NATO officials and member states are working on a new NATO strategy that, in my view, should include an explicit dimension dedicated to this space if you think of how many member states are directly in this space. NATO strategy needs to be aimed at containing Russia and, frankly, reaching a common position on Turkey as an ambiguous state that also controls the choke point in the region, as well as is increasingly present out of its territory in disputes and conflicts that place it at odds with the West. And then we need to think about this region and Western strategy outside the box that is NATO, because of some impediments that the NATO framework really has. For instance, Ukraine's and Georgia's NATO membership and hence security guarantee under Article 5 are for now off the table. But to increase resilience of these US strategic allies, multinational cooperation through shared capability development, military and civilian, needs to be developed outside of the NATO framework in coalitions of the willing formats. This would enable also circumventing the consensus needed for NATO and would enable permanent or rotational maritime security and more free navigation in these spaces between these seas, on sea and on land, if you think about transit in the South Caucasus. So to conclude, if we are to change our way of thinking on regional Western strategy and coalitions of the willing for added value in terms of providing Western security for this inherently insecure space, we would manage to concretely and without much cost increase the Western presence in the region, in that it becomes more efficient in providing security and democracy, sell American gas or whatever else the US foreign policy prioritizes in this and the next administrations. So thank you so much for listening to me and your attention. And I look forward to all of your questions and feedback.
Thank you, Dr. Joja. So we do have a little bit of time for questions. As I said before, you can either put your questions in the chat, either directly to me or to everyone, or you can go ahead and use the raise hand function. So you will see a reactions button down at the bottom of your screen, and that'll give you the option to raise your hand. And I am happy to call on you. All right, Dimitrios, I see your hand.
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Dr. Joja, for that presentation. In regard to your closing comments in regard to sort of the bilateral side of things, that's something that in the Eastern Med, there has been sort of bilateral cooperation, obviously excluding Turkey, but between Greece, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, and so forth, in sort of a way that maybe wouldn't have been traditionally countries that we see aligned, especially since Greece didn't even recognize Israel for many years, and now is, for a lot closer with them. Do you think that will serve as sort of a model for that type of approach, or do you think that that type of bilateral arrangement is kind of not being taken seriously by sort of the bigger players that are affected by this region?
Thank you, Dimitrios. That's a great question, and it's one of the issues that I hadn't addressed, but was kind of pending in that. You mean the Club Med, right? And the Club Med, I think it makes a lot of sense. Thank you for bringing that up. To think of that as an example of coalitions of the willing, right? Unlikely coalitions, political and increasingly security, that circumvent frameworks like NATO or the EU that are based on consensus, and that can actually change the dynamic. So we see with the Club Med some real progress in terms of at least putting out an opposition, an active opposition to Turkey that we're talking about in this space. And in the exclusive economic zones, we see clearly a dispute with bilateral treaties that are being agreed, or multilaterally maybe increasing, that are being agreed to address some of these disputes. So you have the Libya treaty, you have now Egypt increasingly cooperating, Israel as well, as you pointed out, in a complicated relationship with Greece. So I think that's an excellent example of how we can think about multilateralism in efficient ways that creates kind of groups of willing and able that can create opposition and sort of challenge Eastern dimensions of security with Western dimensions of security.
Thank you so much for that question. Anyone else want to share a question? Or I know that Dr. Joja is also open to feedback. I believe you said that earlier, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Please let me know if I made major mistakes, or if there's any major disputes. I'm more than happy to discuss.
And I know you said that this is part of a book you're working on, correct?
That's well, it's an incipient part of it's an initial project of a book in terms of how we can think about new regions that, as I mentioned, we haven't discussed or defined as such, and how we can think about them in terms of new power competition, and with the developments in technology, specifically energy and military, as I've tried to show, how that is changing power dynamics, and where the West should step in further, or should develop a strategy maybe of even abstaining in order to pursue its interests in some of these regions.
Eric, I see you have a question.
Sorry, just a second. I haven't used Zoom in ages. Yes, so I just wanted to quickly ask, first off, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I thought it was a great use of Google Earth to show the complexity of the region. Can you speak a bit more? You spoke about the US's bilateral relationships. Can you speak a bit more to bilateral relationships between countries in the region? My mind went to security cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine and the increasing space there. Are there other areas that are blind spots for the US and blind spots for Americans from where you sit as a European?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Eric. There's a lot, but it's chaotic still. And I think the maps reflect that a lot. So you do have, I mean, there in fashion right now are strategic partnerships, and we do talk about them a lot, and they do make a lot of sense, especially bilaterally. We have strong strategic partnerships, for instance, of the United States with Romania, with Georgia, with Ukraine, and that space in the north, and we can go further down, and then it becomes even more complex with Israel, US, for instance. But in terms of what you mean, Eric, between other countries, that obviously as a trend took on as well. So it is so complicated that it is hard at some point to put them together, or I haven't figured out a visual help of really building them, but there's a lot. So for instance, looking at the Black Sea, Romania has strategic partnerships with Azerbaijan, and I think that's energy, safely to say. And then there's a new strategic partnership between Ukraine and Georgia, for instance, that's in the new, and it's very politicized at the moment, but there's a lot of cooperation and would help them, build their argument for entering NATO or getting closer to NATO, what their priority is. And yes, you have, for instance, Turkey, Ukraine, that's very much into news right now, because Turkey is such a complex player. If you think about Turkey, Ukraine strategic partnership that is built on ethnic elements, Crimean Tatars, in the role that Turkey decided to play as a reluctant player in the Black Sea, though being a major naval power in the Black Sea. And we do see that with the blue homeland strategy of Turkey, that it prioritizes clearly the south and not the north. But then you see Turkey as such a complex player, building at the same time some NATO member state, and then S-400s of Russia, the sanctions from the United States, and now just in these days around the Brussels summit, a decision of EU and US to coordinate on Turkey. So maybe that will lead to something. Should the West support Ukraine, Turkey, for instance, strategic partnership, or one of these examples? Yes, definitely. But we have to take into account a military transfer and offsets and so on. Ukraine is still a major defense industry producer. It has complicated ties, for instance, with China, that puts it at odds with the United States as well. And you see all around, I alluded to it at the beginning or somewhere in the middle of my presentation, that you see China increasingly in the region, and the United States, especially in the former Trump administration with Pompeo, vetoing that and trying to refurbish strategic alliances so that they go the Western way and not the Eastern way. So I don't know if that is an answer to how we should address them. I think we have to address them one by one, and then think about where it makes sense to develop them. But as a last note on that, I would add that there's a lot more to be done. So just because I focused on the Black Sea specifically right now, Romania has a strategic partnership as the U.S. major strategic partner in the region, and a kind of medium to big country in the region, has a strategic partnership with Azerbaijan, underbuilt, underdeveloped because of just energy and because of authoritarian regime versus democracy. But it doesn't have one with Ukraine, its major neighbor, or with Georgia, though it has the pretension of bringing the West into the Black Sea. So there's a lot of possibilities of cooperation bilaterally and multilaterally that to me are underexplored, and where the United States probably is the one who can push for more cooperation, because so far they haven't managed on their own.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. It was a great answer.
Thank you.
We have time for just about one more question. All right, Rufin, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, Iulia, for this really, really beautiful presentation. And I've never seen Google Earth being put to such a good sense here. My question is also a Romania-centric one, because we've seen Mr. Aurescu, our foreign affairs minister, yesterday after the Foreign Affairs Committee in Brussels strongly advocating for the West to keep open the dialogue with Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean issue. And I was wondering, what do you make of this? Is this Romania's way of luring Turkey back into creating that elusive fleet in the Black Sea, or do you think it has to do with again, it's something that originates in Romania's strong strategic partnership with the US? How should we read Mr. Aurescu's declarations?
That's an interesting question. Thank you, Rufin. It goes back, as many of you know, to a complicated history. But when I was showing the choke point of around Istanbul, it was also a short way for me or I should have mentioned the Montreux Convention, which is what enables Turkey to regulate military presence, including Western military presence, and limit free navigation in that highly contested space around the anti-Axis area denial of Russia and its power projection to the south. And so far we've seen from Turkey, right? You mentioned that with a NATO Black Sea fleet as an elusive project. We've seen a reluctance of Turkey traditional to let the West into some of these spaces, if they can prevent that. But thinking about region making, it is true that I think Romania and other countries realize that, unfortunately, despite Turkey's very complicated foreign policy orientation and defense policy overall, right now with the current international structure and law, we have no choice but to ensure Turkish buy-in because of the way they can limit access to the Black Sea. Now, of course, there's way to think around that and to get ships into the sea that are Western but under different flags, like regional flags. So that changes the dynamic as well. But if we are to go by engaging Turkey, right, the EU High Representative yesterday, I think, said carrots and sticks for Turkey, but in a transatlantic approach in coordination with the United States. Maybe the second part of your question makes or suggestion does make a lot of sense, that we could see some of these moves as trying to engage Turkey through not directly through the United States, because sanctions and a disputed relationship, more complicated with the Armenia genocide coming up as a memory in the next month. So with all these complicated issues, if the United States, and now it's purely guesswork, is trying to engage its strategic allies like Romania to engage with Turkey, to bring Turkey more on board, that could be a possible explanation for that.
Thank you very much, wonderful.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much to Dr. Joja for the wonderful presentation and discussion. If folks want to keep up with your work, where can they find you online?
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you. Without you, none of this would have been possible. So thank you so much for setting it up. Usually, Google is a good choice for me. I publish most of my work at MEI. I teach at Georgetown, but that's class that's off the record. And so just online. Now we're living in the Zoom area in ERA. So I think just Google or Google Scholar can help if they do want to keep up with that space and that work. And I am always looking forward to feedback from people interested and experts from this region as things are evolving and developing. Having such a fantastic audience like here, CSS is an ideal platform. So please continue to, or if you haven't, so reach out to me with your ideas and your feedback to make our work better.
Wonderful, and thank you to everyone in the audience today. For those of you who are diehard fans of the Security Around the World series that we're running this semester, we will be taking a break for spring break next week, and then to do some student-focused events immediately following, but we will have a few more talks coming up at the end of April, so do keep an eye out for all of those. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.